Hello and welcome to this video. It's the continuation in the series on Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of Four. Today we're looking at the author's use of language. Please do pick up the ebook for £3.99. It contains everything you see in this video series as well as the original text, and it's available at mrbruff.com or on Amazon. So the language that's used in The Sign of Four is typical, really, of the Victorian period to a large extent, in terms of its complexity and the author's fondness for long, rambling sentences. Conan Doyle's use of language is particularly apparent in how he uses the setting of London almost like a character in itself, and we've talked about that in the video on setting. It's interesting to take this example in its entirety and examine how the author's use of language brings the city to life, highlighting both its positive and negative facets. So have a look at this little extract, and we're going to look at the negative vocabulary and imagery, which is in red, and the positive, which is in blue. It was a September evening and not yet 7 o'clock, but the day had been a dreary one, and a dense drizzly fog lay low upon the great city. Mud-coloured clouds drooped sadly over the muddy streets. Down the Strand the lamps were but misty splotches of diffused light, which threw a feeble circular glimmer upon the slimy pavement. The yellow glare from the shop windows streamed out into the steamy, vaporous air, and threw a murky, shifting radiance across the crowded thoroughfare. There was, to my mind, something eerie and ghost-like in the endless procession of faces which flitted across these narrow bars of light. Sad faces and glad, haggard and merry. Like all humankind, they flitted from the gloom into the light, and so back into the gloom once more. Now here the author is presenting London as a predominantly negative place where bad things happen and many miserable people live, and this would have been the experience of many of the city's inhabitants. However, as we can see from the light sprinkling of positive language, there's also the suggestion that London, despite its problems, is a positive place. The initial negative description of the city is contrasted with the single, a word, great. And this is also reinforced by the description of the people who, despite a brief flitting from the gloom into the light, were destined to end up back in the gloom once again. In terms of language devices at play, there's also the alliteration used to highlight and intensify the imagery and descriptions. The repetition of the D sound brings to the reader on a journey out into the streets, as we can almost hear the rolling of wheels and the thudding of hooves on the city's cobbled streets as the dreary, dense, drizzly fog sits heavily upon the streets. Added to this, the mud-coloured clouds, and we can see how Conan Doyle attempts to bring the city to life, both through his visual descriptions and the sounds he creates. Another of the author's devices when describing the city is drawing the reader's attention to light and dark. As seen here again, the misty splotches of diffused light are used to create an image of a place where much of what we see is partially obscured in darkness. This can also, of course, be read as metaphorical, the Victorian concern with good and evil, and how you could tell what someone was by looking at them. In a city where so many things were hidden in the darkness, how could any self-respecting gentleman know who to trust? These shades of light and dark and their deeper meanings are used effectively in this next passage. We had indeed reached a questionable and forbidding neighbourhood. Long lines of dull brick houses were only relieved by the coarse glare and tawdry brilliancy of public houses at the corner. Then came rows of two-storied villas, each with a fronting of miniature garden, and then again interminable lines of new staring brick buildings, the monster tentacles which the giant city was throwing out into the country. At last the cab drew up at the third house in a new terrace. None of the other houses were inhabited, and that at which we stopped was as dark as its neighbours, save for a single glimmer in the kitchen window. On our knocking, however, the door was instantly thrown open by a Hindu servant clad in a yellow turban, white loose-fitting clothes, and a yellow sash. There was something strangely incongruous in this oriental figure framed in the commonplace doorway of a third-rate suburban dwelling-house. Now, how can we analyse this? Let's have a little think about it. Let's see what we can pick out about the words and phrases that are underlined. So those are the phrases and the parts of the extract that deal with light and dark. The first instance of light being described here is of the coarse and tawdry type from a pub. It's not refined and upmarket, as these were not places where gentlemen of the era would have congregated. They were for the lower classes, who would also have been described by the upper classes as rough and tacky. The fact that none of the houses have light in them makes them appear uninhabited, which creates a sense of desolation and loneliness, and furthers the tension created by our characters being out in the middle of nowhere in a strange part of the city where anything could happen to them. That is, except for a single glimmer in the house they are looking for. And there's a suggestion this light is leading them in the correct direction, the same way sailors and adventurers use stars to guide them. Light's a positive feature here, guiding the crusading detective and his supporters through dark and dangerous terrain.